Bennington Triangle is well known for its mysterious disappearances that happened during the last 3 months of the year between 1945 and 1950. Only 1945, it wasn't the first year something peculiar happened in this vast area of forestry. On December 29th, 1944, at around 3:15 p.m., Chester Cooper left his fiance Florence Brown's house in the town of Bennington, Vermont, and drove his truck northeast of Glastonbury Mountain. Now, as he traveled along a deserted dirt road, his truck stopped without warning, and on inspection he was unable to identify the problem. As he was deciding whether to brave the cold, walk back to the closest town, or wait there for a passerby to help, he heard rustling sounds coming from the tree line and spotted a young girl with a skipping rope heading into the trees. Concerned that a young child was wandering through the forest alone, he got out of his truck and headed into the forest after her. For Chester, this was the beginning of a 3-week ordeal in which he endured a horrific, explainable series of events. Chester only ever gave one account of what happened to him, which he recorded in 1995 on his deathbed. This is a transcription of this account that proves, in his own words, that the horrors of the Bennington Triangle actually began in the winter of 1944. I knew the first time I set eyes on Florence that she was the girl for me. I loved her, feelings she couldn't take away from me, even though in the end she left me with little else. The morning of December 29th was frosty and dull. Christmas was over, and the festive lights roped around town seemed to have lost their shine and dulled. I knew as soon as I arrived at Florence's house that morning and saw the worry in her eyes that her feelings for me had changed. There he was, Theodore Blackwell, the deputy sheriff's son, making his appearance evident from her kitchen window. She told me she loved me, just not as much as she loved Theodore. She handed me back the engagement ring and went on and on about how sorry she was, words that screeched through my head like white noise. I turned and left, leaving the ring in her mailbox. I drove my truck out of Bennington without shedding a tear. On the outside, I was a stone-faced gargoyle, but on the inside, I was tormented in my own ocean of despair. The Green Mountain National Forest was a thing of wonder, but driving past it with my heart shattered beyond repair, all I could think about was how I longed for it to engulf me, a thought that I never thought would hold truth. But then my truck stopped without warning. I checked the engine, but there was no sign of any problems. It didn't make any sense. My truck had half a tank of gas in it, and despite the odd bit of rust here and there, it had always been reliable. I stood next to my truck shivering and cursing about how unfair my life was when I saw her. She was I guess 6 or 7, with her fair hair and 2 long braids, and she was holding a skipping rope. She looked exactly like the childhood pictures I'd seen of Florence. I told myself it must be a coincidence, but then I saw her skipping toward the tree line. I blinked my eyes in disbelief. The forest was no place for a lone child, especially not in these perilous winter months. I ran forward and I shouted, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Only the rustling of leaves responded. I looked from my truck to the forest and I knew I had a choice to make. Report the sighting of the girl to the local sheriff and, no doubt, have Theodore accuse me of making it up due to being rejected, or go after the girl myself. As I stared into the sea of green, I felt this unexplainable feeling. It was as though something was inside of my head whispering for me to step forward. I couldn't fight that feeling just as much as I couldn't just wait there and leave some poor girl alone in the wilderness. I took one look back to my truck before I stepped forward and I lost myself to the forest. I don't know how long I was walking for, calling for that child. My muddy footsteps led me deeper into the forest until I stopped shouting and continued walking. It was then I recall having no recollection of the skipping girl or my broken heart. I looked around me, not knowing anything. It was as though someone had taken an eraser to my mind and rubbed it all out. The only thing inside of my head was the whispering. It seemed as though the trees were talking to me, luring me forward. I remember the panic in not knowing who I was and being a nobody, but thinking back on it, I wish I'd been able to embrace that feeling of nothingness, of a blank where the pain of heartbreak had just been. I carried on walking. Even if I'd wanted to, I don't think I could have stopped. I remember the whispering in my head, mysterious words that lured me forward. I remember turning around and watching the gaps in the trees seem to disappear before my eyes. The leaves and tree trunks seemingly becoming one. It was a blurred wall and I was in its center, with no way out. The trees seemed to be looming over me, suffocating me within that space. I kept on walking until I no longer had anywhere else to walk to, and then I walked on the spot, my feet squelching beneath the mud as I churned it over and over again. It splattered up my pant legs and reached my arms and face. I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. The whispers wouldn't permit me to stop. And then something dropped from the leaves above me and seemed to entangle around me like a snake. I didn't even know what it was at first, but then I saw the plastic rope handles, and even in my blank haze, I knew what it was. A skipping rope. I continued churning my feet in the mud, my entangled body wobbling unsteadily, and I cried out, but I was unable to stop. And when I fell onto my side, I continued moving my feet, as helpless as a knocked-over wind-up toy. I saw a boy run through the gapless trees as if they were transparent. He had a dirt-covered face and a grazed cheek, and he smiled at me. He looked familiar, but back then, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't place him. I wanted to shout at him to leave this cursed place, but no words would even escape my mouth. The boy ran toward me, and then he dropped to his knees amid the mud and stared at me with eyes that turned from vivid blue to pure black circles. His smile flickering and contorting in front of me until he was no longer a boy, but an adult man. An adult man who, despite my phased memory, I knew in my heart looked identical to me. I wanted to scream in horror, but I couldn't. I was trapped in this nightmare. I was falling into it. The mud seemed to cover me, filling my mouth and my eyes and dragging me downward. I fell with a thud, and then the whole world went dark. When I came to, I felt the dry mud itching against my skin and went to scratch it, my arms no longer bound by the skipping rope. I looked around me, trying to make sense of it all. The walls were jagged rocks covered in strange red markings, and the low ceiling looked smoother than the surrounding walls. I felt something dig into my thigh and stared down at the floor, and as soon as I did, I wish I hadn't. I gasped in pure, undiluted horror. It was a bone. A human bone, yellowed with age. I jerked back, desperate to get away from it, but that's when I saw what I was lying on. Bones. Human bones. The entire ground was made up of them. Bones of every type, femurs and rib cages and shoulder blades and hands and feet and yellowed skulls. Some bones I knew the names of, but most I didn't. The mystery parts were scattered across the floor and stuck there as if they'd been cemented in place with a colorless substance. I tried to move away, but something unseen stopped me. It forced me into a lying position and made me stretch out my arms and legs and smack my head against the bone ground. I thought this was it. I was going to die down there. I was going to decay and rot away until my corpse became the foundation of this boneyard. I heard it, even though I couldn't move my head to see it. Sharp footsteps thudded across the floor of bones toward me. The sound echoed inside of my head and filled it with dread. Thinking you're about to die, but not being able to try to move away from this. That was the most horrifying thing I've ever endured. It changes a person. That moment changed me. I held my breath, I'm not sure why. And then I saw a shadow flickering above me. Eyes stared down at me, recognizable, vivid blue eyes on a familiar face. And then it changed to flecked amber eyes on the shadowy face of death. All I remember are those eyes getting closer and closer to me, as if they wanted to devour me. And then it moved out of my eye line, but I knew it was still there, leaning over me. And then I felt a burning sensation, but couldn't place where on my body it was coming from. I heard and smelt the sizzling burning of skin. That thing was doing this. I just didn't know why or how. The burning continued, though, charring me at will, and as it did, the smooth ceiling seemed to blur around me. It was agonizing, and not knowing the full gravity of the situation made it worse. I honestly believed that that thing was eating me alive, but I didn't know which parts of my body it had started with. I don't know how long I was lying there. I just remember having the realization that the worst of the pain had stopped. I was numb, and although the cave was silent, it felt like the walls were pulsing, as though they were one connected heartbeat, as though I was now in the belly of the beast. The whispers sounded in my head, only this time they grew more distant. I remember the cavern of bones fading around me, fading into darkness. And then I heard a trickle of water, and I felt the long blades of grass tickling my nose. I thought I was dead and that my mind was tricking me. I lay there unflinching, waiting for death to become something more. I managed to lull my head to the side, and I saw a girl in the distance, 6 or 7, with her hair in 2 braids. She was holding a skipping rope in her hands, and I saw her smile, I heard her giggle, and then she turned and skipped away from me, disappearing into the trees. I saw amber eyes, and I thought it was back to get me. I tried coiling in horror, but I was too weak to move. Wet nostrils flared, followed by a rough tongue licking my cheek. Faded voices came in and out of my head, and distant sirens led to a white room of light. I knew that I wasn't dead, but in the hospital. When I told the doctor my truck had broken down on December 29th, he looked at me with confusion. I later found out it was January 21st. I'd been lost in the wild for 3 weeks, yet my memories and the fresh burns across my body told otherwise. It had felt like a matter of hours, not weeks. This is something that I've never been able to explain, but which I've carried with me for all of these years. As soon as I was well enough, I left Vermont behind, and I never went back. My memories returned to me. Once I was back in reality, and I knew who I was and the pang of heartbreak. I couldn't stay and watch Florence marry another man. I couldn't stare into his vivid blue eyes and be okay with that. Just as much as I couldn't stay near the forest where I know that thing lived. I kept quiet because I didn't think I would have been believed. I never read the papers, I just wanted to escape from the world. It was years later when I came across the disappearances that happened in and around Bennington County. That's when I first came across the nickname given to it, the Bennington Triangle. The guilt ate me up, and it's been doing so ever since. I should have said something. I should have done something. But who would have believed me? I don't know why I was spared. Maybe it was too early for the thing to surface. I just don't know. But I think that thing, whatever it was able to manipulate my thoughts and trick and control me. All I do know is that I am just a nobody with a story that I carried with me for over 50 years. Chester was discovered by a dog walker named Edward Jenkins, whose dog sniffed him out in the overgrowth by Deer Lick Brook. Although Chester is adamant he spent 3 weeks in the wild, his body showed no signs of hunger or dehydration, and the cuts, bruises, and strange burns covering his skin looked fresh. 3 weeks had passed since Chester had stepped into the Bennington Triangle, yet his lack of hair growth or malnourishment told a different story. A year later, when all of the disappearances began, little connection was made to what happened to Chester Cooper. He remained quiet for over 50 years, hopeful that by doing so, the evil that lived out there would leave both him and other people be. The Bennington Triangle disappearances remain one of the world's biggest unsolved mysteries. Every year, investigators flock to the Green Mountains to immerse themselves in the surroundings. But the fact remains that over 70 years later, there are still no answers about what happened out there where time itself seems to stop. For more scary horror stories, please share and subscribe. See you in the next video.